What if America's first oil millionaires weren't the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, or the wildcat drillers of Texas, but a native nation that the United States government had once tried to erase? What if beneath the myth of frontier prosperity lay a story of blood, deceit, and betrayal so vast that it changed the direction of American law, business, and race relations forever? In the early 1900s, the Osage people of Oklahoma became the richest individuals per capita on Earth. But their fortune came with a curse, because every barrel of oil they struck made them a target. Within a few short years, dozens of Osage men, women, and children were dead, shot, poisoned, bombed, or vanished. The killers? Not outlaws or bandits, but respected townsmen, bankers, sheriffs, doctors, businessmen, and even husbands. The conspiracy was so widespread that local lawmen turned a blind eye, coroners falsified reports, and newspapers printed stories that painted victims as drunk, reckless, or deserving. Yet what if the real story was never about individual greed or local crime at all? What if the Osage murders were simply the visible wound of something far more systemic, a machinery of dispossession that had been perfected for centuries, now adapted to the age of oil? Tonight we dig beneath the surface of this dark chapter and ask the question history tried to bury. How did America's oil boom begin? Not with discovery and innovation, but with the orchestrated theft of Indian territory through paper, power, and murder. Before the oil, before the blood, there was exile. The Osage once lived across vast stretches of what is now Missouri, Kansas, and Arkansas. They hunted bison on rolling prairies and traded with neighboring nations long before Europeans ever set foot in North America. But by the mid-19th century, they had been pushed westward again and again by broken treaties, waves of settlers, and federal removal policies. By the 1870s, they faced a terrible choice: sell the last of their Kansas lands or face starvation and violence. They chose to sell, but on their own terms. The Osage leaders used the proceeds to purchase a new tract of land in Indian Territory, what is now northeastern Oklahoma. They didn't ask for it. They bought it outright. It was rocky, hilly, and filled with scrub, useless for farming, unattractive to settlers, isolated from the nearest rail lines. That was precisely why they wanted it. In a world where every fertile acre was being stolen, this land seemed safe, invisible. But what no one realized then was that beneath that scrub and stone was a sea of oil, millions of barrels locked in shale and limestone. When oil prospectors began drilling in the early 1900s, they hit gushers that blackened the horizon and made instant millionaires. The Osage, unlike most native nations, had negotiated to keep their mineral rights. So while white settlers bought surface land for pennies, the Osage retained ownership of everything beneath the soil. Every tribal member was granted a head right, a share in the communal oil wealth. By 1920, those head rights were worth the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of dollars a year per person. Mansions rose from the prairie. Families sent their children to European schools. They rode in chauffeured cars, wore Parisian fashions, and hired white servants in towns that barely had paved streets. The Osage were living what Americans claimed to dream of: success, independence, prosperity. But that image defied every racial expectation of the time. In an America that still enforced segregation and Jim Crow, white society could not stomach the sight of native families outspending bankers, doctors, and judges. And so, with the blessing of Washington, a new system was created to solve what they called the Indian problem once more. This time, not through forced removal, but through forced dependence. The Osage had the money, but the government claimed they didn't have the capacity to manage it. Congress declared that full-blooded Osage adults were incompetent and therefore required white guardians, court-appointed custodians, to oversee their finances. Every expenditure, from buying a car to paying a doctor's bill, had to be signed off by a guardian. These guardians were almost always local white men, bankers, lawyers, ranchers, appointed by county judges who themselves were part of the same social circle. On paper, it was protection. In practice, it was legalized theft. Guardians skimmed profits, bought goods at inflated prices from their own stores, and kept the difference. They filed false reports, pocketed royalties, and claimed to be acting in the best interests of their wards. Some took things even further, by controlling who an Osage could marry, what property they could own, or even whether they received medical care. A man could be rich enough to buy a fleet of cars, yet be forbidden to purchase one without his guardian's approval. The system was built on humiliation and dependence, and it created an invisible economy of predation, where every Osage death meant someone else got richer. Head rights, those precious shares of oil wealth, were inheritable. If an Osage person died, their head rights passed to their legal heirs, and under the new system, that often meant a white guardian, a white spouse, or a conveniently positioned friend. Suddenly, funerals became business opportunities. The guardianship system didn't just enable corruption, it incentivized murder. It started quietly. A shot fired on a back road, a body found in a ravine, a sickness that spread too quickly, ending in death before anyone could ask questions. Between 1921 and 1926, the Osage Nation became a community under siege. Entire families were targeted. The most infamous case was that of Molly Burkhart, an Osage woman whose family line became a map of death. Her sister Anna was found shot in the head and dumped in a gully. Another sister, Rita, and Rita's husband were killed when their house exploded in the middle of the night. Dynamite planted beneath their bedroom. Molly's mother, Lizzie, died slowly of what was called wasting illness, though later evidence suggested poison. Molly herself began to fall ill, her health deteriorating mysteriously as those around her died. These were not random acts of violence. They were methodical. Local authorities ignored evidence. Doctors falsified death certificates, calling obvious poisonings natural causes. Undertakers destroyed samples. The county sheriff, the very man meant to uphold the law, was on the payroll of the murderers. The press labeled the victims troublemakers or wild spenders. The killers moved easily through town, attending church on Sunday and plotting murders on Monday. Behind many of these crimes stood a single, powerful man, William Hale, known as the King of the Osage Hills. Hale was a rancher, businessman, and philanthropist who publicly posed as a friend of the Osage people. He donated money to schools and local causes, played the part of a benevolent patriarch, but behind the scenes, he orchestrated a network of killers, conspirators, and bribed officials whose goal was simple: to inherit the Osage fortune by any means necessary. When the murders became too many to ignore, and the Osage Nation's petitions reached Washington, the federal government was forced to act. The Bureau of Investigation, what would later become the FBI, was sent in under the direction of a young, ambitious J. Edgar Hoover. For Hoover, this was a chance to prove his agency's worth on a national stage. But what he faced in Osage County was a world of silence, fear, and corruption so deep that no one would talk. Local juries were rigged, witnesses were terrified, and evidence vanished. Hoover assigned Tom White, a former Texas Ranger, to lead a small team of undercover agents. They disguised themselves as ranchers, cowboys, and businessmen, living among the locals, listening to gossip in saloons and trading posts. Slowly, they began to unravel the web. They found forged wills, bank records showing illegal transfers, and witnesses who described seeing hired gunmen near victims' homes. The evidence pointed straight to William Hale. He had convinced his nephew, Ernest Burkhart, Molly's white husband, to marry into the family and then help orchestrate the killings so that the inheritance would pass to him. The conspiracy was vast, involving corrupt officials, law enforcement, and businessmen. When the Bureau finally arrested Hale and his associates, it shocked the nation. Newspapers called it the Reign of Terror. The trial revealed details so horrifying that even seasoned agents were shaken. Witnesses described payments for killings, forged insurance policies, and cover-ups that reached into state offices. Hale was eventually convicted and sentenced to life in prison, but only for a handful of murders. Dozens of others went unpunished. Many killers were never charged, and the names of their victims faded from the record. The FBI hailed the case as a victory, but for the Osage, it was only a partial justice. Even with Hale behind bars, the machinery of theft didn't stop. The guardianship laws remained in place for years. Many Osage families never regained control of their own finances, and countless head rights had already been transferred through fraud or inheritance to white guardians, corporations, and investors. In 1925, Congress finally changed the law so that only individuals of Osage ancestry could inherit head rights. But by then, enormous damage had been done. Millions of dollars, billions in today's money, had been stolen or siphoned away. Entire generations lost not only wealth, but land, autonomy, and the psychological security of self-determination. Even today, a portion of Osage head rights remain in the hands of non-Osage entities, oil companies, churches, and descendants of the very people who exploited the system. The Reign of Terror was not just a series of murders. It was the final chapter in a long story of calculated dispossession. For centuries, native nations were pushed from land to land until the only places left were those considered worthless. Then, when those lands proved valuable, whether for gold, timber, or oil, the process began again, wrapped in new legal language, overseen by new bureaucrats, and justified by the same old prejudice. The Osage murders exposed this system for what it was, not the product of a few greedy men, but the logical outcome of American expansionism, where profit was built on someone else's erasure. Today, the Osage Nation stands resilient. They have rebuilt their community, regained partial control of their mineral estate, and turned their story into a testament of endurance. The oil still flows, but so does the memory. The hills of Osage County remain haunted by names unspoken, by graves unmarked, by wealth that turned to blood. The Reign of Terror isn't just history, it's a mirror. It reflects how easily systems of power can turn protection into predation and law into theft. The same forces that robbed the Osage are not relics of the past. They are woven into the modern structures of resource control, land ownership, and corporate greed. When we talk about the American dream, we have to ask, whose dream and at what cost? The Osage story forces us to see that the line between civilization and exploitation is paper thin and written in ink that still stains the soil. So when we think about the rise of America's oil empires, about the fortunes that built cities and corporations, we should remember whose hands first touched that oil and whose lives were drained to fuel its promise. The land remembers. The silence remembers. And perhaps by telling these stories, we can make sure history doesn't stay buried beneath the wells that made America rich. What did you think about today's video? Comment your thoughts and suggestions for my next video below.